Hello and welcome to Gardening Basics with 4-HBC. This is our 10th and final lesson in a series of short videos on beginner gardening topics ranging from planting your garden all the way to harvesting your produce. My name is Rihanna and I am a 4-HBC ambassador from the Fraser Valley, and it is my pleasure to introduce our gardening expert, Emma. Emma, would you be able to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Rihanna, and hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us all the way for 10 episodes. If you haven't seen anything already, a little bit about myself. I've been gardening for the last 10 years, and I also work and teach in agricultural education and deliver a bunch of different gardening programs throughout the Fraser Valley.
Thank you, Emma. We are looking forward to learning more today about gardening. What will we be covering today?
So today in our last lesson, we're going to be looking at all of the various different things that you can do to help put your garden to bed. So these are things like cover cropping and various different winter crops. So what will last in your garden that you might already have in there, and then what you can plant for harvesting later on, and then different types of mulches and all of the benefits that they can add to your garden. So first up, we're going to talk a little bit about cover cropping. So I've made a short video to kind of explain some of the basics.
Hey everyone, so first up we're going to talk about cover cropping. So cover cropping is one of the techniques that you can do to help fertilize your soil or prepare your soil for the winter time. One of the major reasons that you would do something like cover cropping is that it's a good way to help prevent erosion. So if you leave your soil bare over the winter time, what can happen is things like rain and wind events can take off a lot of your topsoil. So cover cropping is a really good option to help keep some of that soil stabilized. And then basically what you do is that in the springtime, the idea of cover cropping is that you're actually going to work this green material back into your soil bed and keep the nutrients in your soil. So not only is it a great way to prevent things like erosion, but it actually helps add nutrients to your soil as well. So this is kind of an example of cover cropping, albeit not the best one. So what we have in this bed is a plant called buckwheat. Buckwheat makes a really, really excellent cover crop. It is a nitrogen fixing legume, so it will actually add a lot of nitrogen into your soil. The only problem with this one is that there wasn't very good germination. So when you're looking at doing your cover cropping, you have to make sure that you've got your timing right and that you're doing it when you have a stretch of warm weather coming up so that you can look at your germination and hope that you can get enough days over about 7 to 10 degrees Celsius so that you're actually going to see those plants germinate and take hold. Once they've germinated, your cover crop should last you over the entire winter time, and then you can tow it or turn it back under your soil and add those nutrients into your soil. So buckwheat is one of the things that we can use for cover cropping. Another really popular one would be something like fall rye or something like vetch. These are all fairly common cover crops that you can use, and you can find them typically at any seed supply store that sells things like cover crops.
Like I mentioned, cover cropping refers to planting certain types of fast-growing crops in your garden either between harvests or over winter to help build your soil health while your garden rests. So you can actually put a cover crop on in between two harvests. Say you have an area that you've planted some spring plants and then you don't want to plant anything else into it until later in the summer. You could put a fast-growing cover crop on there. So there's no real time limit on where you put a cover crop onto. But one of the main reasons that we will use things like cover crops is this idea that it keeps it covered in organic matter. So this will help do things like improve your soil structure, it will prevent erosion, and improves water holding capacity and helps to control weeds. So if you think about if you just have a bed that is bare soil and you get anything like a really strong rain event or heavy winds that come along, a lot of your soil can be lost or damaged in those events. So having that green kind of organic matter on top of your soil is going to help it keep it in place. So unfortunately in the video that wasn't the best example. What you would really be looking for is kind of a nice dense mat of that crop in order to keep your soil protected. So then in the springtime, you're going to work the cover crops back into your soil to provide a green manure. And so this just means that you're adding nutrients and organic matter directly into your garden bed. All of the greenery that you're using in that cover crop is going to get added in, and it will start to decompose and provide nutrients to your soil. So we talked a little bit about buckwheat, but you can also use things like fall rye, vetch, clover, beans, peas, oats, and winter wheat. Now, you may notice that a few of those that I just mentioned are going to be legumes. So those are things like your clover, your beans, and your peas. And the reason that we use those is that all of those plants are actual nitrogen fixators. And so they will give you the extra added benefit of having that nitrogen fixated into your soil. So keep in mind timing, like with the video, you do want to make sure that you're getting it in soon enough that your plants will be able to germinate properly. Right now is really kind of getting close to the last time that you'll be able to do a cover crop planting. So this is the end of September right now. And then after that, realistically, and especially depending on where you are in BC, your average temperatures are just going to be a little bit too cold. So make sure you do keep an eye on that. Next up, we'll talk about some winter crops, what will last in your garden, and things that you can be planting right now. So take a look at this little video.
So next up, we're talking about winter options for your garden. So if you have things like kale or cabbage, a lot of these crops will actually grow kind of like a perennial, and they'll keep you going all the way through the winter time. So things like especially this green leafed or this green curled leafed kale is really great. You can keep harvesting that all the way through the winter. Even after a frost, you can usually still get new leaves producing themselves depending on how mild your winter is. And then after that, I wanted to talk a little bit about doing things like planting garlic. So as many of you may know, now is the perfect time to start thinking about planting your garlic. And so in this bed here, what I have is leftover peas and beans. And so this is a really good spot to think about planting your garlic if you've got a bed of peas or beans, because what these plants actually do, and if you remember back to talking about things like fertilizing and amendments, is that certain plants will actually fixate nitrogen into your soil, and peas and beans are two of the ones that do that. So these plants have nitrogen fixing nodules on their roots. And so what we're going to do here is I'm actually going to take these plants and cut them at the base and leave all of their roots in the soil. So this will be the perfect basis. It's a really nice, already fertilized bed, so that when I'm planting my garlic has something to go into that's going to be well fertilized. Garlic is best planted in the fall, and then you would typically harvest it around July. It's nice to plant garlic into kind of a loamy soil, and you're going to plant your bulbs a few inches deep into the soil. Make sure that it's kind of nice and loose, and then afterwards you would cover with something like a mulch.
So like I mentioned in the video, some plants will overwinter very well in your garden. So that blue leaf kale is a really good example of it. But realistically, most kale species will do really well over your colder months. And then there are a lot of different plants like Brussels sprouts that do best after being harvested after a first frost. So they actually get a better flavor to them. Kale is another one of those as well. And then in addition to that, a lot of different root vegetables will do well when left in the ground over the winter. So things like your carrots, your beets and potatoes, you can actually just leave those in your garden as long as it's not waterlogged and has good drainage, and they will keep better than if you tried to store them inside. So what I usually do with those with those root vegetables is I like to just keep them in my garden and then dig them up whenever I'm ready to use them in a meal. And then a lot of different crops that grow in winter with the help of something like a cold frame or a row cover to actually help keep them warm. So that would be when you have some sort of protective covering over top of your crops, like a little mini greenhouse or a little greenhouse tarp cover. And so things like lettuce, spinach, and scallions, those ones you can realistically keep them alive in some sort of covered option and can be sown until the end of September, although they typically won't do so well as soon as you get a really cold frost and then the snow starts to fly. So lastly is that fall is the time to plant garlic. Garlic can be planted from around mid-September all the way until the soil is still workable. Best planting time is usually sometime around October. And so you want to plant your cloves with your skin intact at about 2 to 3 inches deep into loose, loamy soil. So you want to cover them with a light mulch to protect your cloves and prevent soil erosion. And then you're actually going to harvest those in the July of the following year. So something I like to think about with my garlic is that I'll put that into a bed where I'm planning on the springtime to add things like lettuce or spinach or radishes, any of those really fast growing crops, because your garlic will germinate and will start to poke up in the springtime. And so then you can plant the rest of your crops around it. So you get a lot of different uses out of those beds. So yes, cover your garlic with a mulch and then make sure that you just keep it watered and looking good, and you will have your garlic to harvest come July. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about mulches and some of the amazing benefits that they have for your garden.
So last up, we're going to talk about mulching your beds and the idea of adding nutrients to your garden and also doing things like preventing erosion by kind of covering up your soil and making sure that it's not going to be exposed to a lot of the elements over the wintertime. So you can use a variety of things for mulching, and we've talked about this before. Really good ones are things like leaves, so anything from maple leaves to alder to birch. These are all really, really great leaves that are a fantastic mulch to put on your garden. Things like straw, these are all really great for making sure that your soil stays nicely covered and is protected from the elements. But there are some certain types of leaves that are not as fast to break down. And so here I have a really good example of that. These are leaves from an oak tree, and this has actually been in this black plastic bag since last year. So these were raked up last year and put in a black plastic bag. As you can see, they haven't actually broken down a whole lot. So if you put something like an oak leaf on your garden, you're not going to get that same effect like you would with some of the other ones where it will break down really easily, and then by the springtime you'll have a really nice kind of rich soil to add into your garden. So you do kind of have to pay attention. But what you can do with these, that's kind of a nice alternative, is that if you leave them in this black plastic, you can do what we have, what we kind of call leaf mold. And so here is what happens after 1 year. But this right here is actually what happens after a few years. So you can see that some of the stuff, this hasn't really been turned very often. So this is kind of what it looks like as it kind of gets further in that decomposition process. But after a while, you get this really fantastic dark leaf mold, which is not actually mold at all, but it's a really nice organically rich nutrient that you can add onto your garden. So this takes a little bit more planning and forethought, but if you add this to your garden in the springtime, it's a fantastic amendment. It's got a ton of organic nutrients in it, and I'll see if I can see them, but this particular one actually has a ton of earthworms and other really great things that are going to help your soil structure and quality. So when you're looking at applying things like a mulch or a leaf mold to your garden, it's really nice to look at applying them to things like perennial plants. So here I have a currant bush, and then behind me I have some blueberry bushes. These are all really great ones that would really benefit from having some of that extra protection over the winter time. So when you're looking at applying, you can basically just take handfuls of your mulch or your leaf mold and put them on your bed and kind of spread them around the base of your plants. And this essentially just covers up some of that bare soil and gives those plants a little bit of extra added warmth over the winter months and a little bit of protection. And then you can really just turn that in the springtime and you'll get extra organic nutrients for your garden as well.
Just like at any other time of year, mulching is really beneficial for your garden. But over the winter especially, it provides some additional benefits compared to mulching at any other time. So mulching in general will do things like reduce erosion. It's going to help you control your weeds. And then when you're using an organic mulch, we'll add some of that more organic material back into your bed. But over the winter time, it really helps to insulate your plants against cold weather. So this will also help prevent major fluctuations in temperature. So some of those really dramatic spikes in temperature where it goes from like quite a nice day and then all of a sudden the temperature drops down really drastically, that spike in temperature can actually be really damaging to your plants and will have impacts on their period of dormancy. So if you think about a lot of overwintering plants, so your perennials like your blueberries or any of those kind of crops, they do go into a dormancy period, and so those major fluctuations or spikes in temperature can be kind of damaging. When you're choosing a mulch material for your winter garden, you should look at choosing one that will help trap air and insulate. So these can be things like shredded leaves, like we talked about, or straw. Those are both really good ones to help give that insulating factor for your plants over the winter. And then pay attention, like I mentioned, to the type of leaves that you're using when you mulch with leaves, because not all of the leaves break down in the same way, and some can actually kind of hinder that decomposition or at least slow it down rather than help it. So these are just things to keep an eye out for when you're choosing what mulches you put on your garden.
Thank you, Emma. It was really interesting learning about the different cover crops and that legumes are actually really good because of their nitrogen fixing properties. I do have a couple questions based on your presentation. Firstly, talking about cover crops, would you recommend certain cover crops for certain regions of BC?
Yeah, Rihanna, that's a really good question. I'm glad that you asked it. So, for sure, if you're a little bit more central or perhaps a bit more northern in BC, you're going to want to look for cover crops that can handle cooler temperatures. So those would be anything like your fall rye and your winter wheat. Those are really, really cold hardy crops, so they do really well. Whereas things like vetch and buckwheat especially, is definitely more of a delicate cover crop, and so it will not do as well if you have those very, very cold temperatures. So it's a good question. For sure, when you're looking at cover crops, your wheats and your rye are going to be a lot more suited for colder climates, and also things like your clover, but your beans and your peas and your vetch is going to have a little bit harder of a time.
All right, thank you. Also, you mentioned on your last slide that some leaves actually hinder the decomposition process. And I'm wondering if you can mention which types of leaves specifically can hinder that process and how they do that.
Absolutely, and that's another really good question. So for the majority of leaves that you would typically see kind of around the landscape in your area, things like maple and your alder and your birch leaves, those are kind of your more common ones, and those are all great to use as a mulch. But if you're looking at things like I mentioned in the video, oak is, and it's not that it's particularly bad, but it just breaks down much slower, and so it will, if you're looking to get that kind of organic nutrient added into your soil, oak won't really do that. And what it can actually do is it can actually create a layer where your water won't get through. So if you have a really thick layer of oak leaves on your garden, then sometimes it'll actually shed water, which is not necessarily what we hope to have happen when we think about our garden. Another example of one that you don't want to use would be something like cedar leaves. So a lot of our conifers, but cedar boughs in particular, are really acidic. And so those will actually change the pH in your soil. So if you can avoid any type of cedar leaves or any of those conifer leaves that drop onto the ground, those are not the best thing to be using at mulch. So you want to see if you can find anything, yes, maple or birch or alder, or any of those kind of easy to find ones that break down quite quickly, but still give your garden that extra bit of protection.
Awesome, thank you so much. And thank you for all the great information on putting your garden to bed. So this does conclude our gardening basics series with 4-HBC. And thank you to everyone who has followed along with the series, and we hope that you have learned lots as well. And a big thank you to Emma for taking the time to share your gardening expertise with us.
Thank you so much, Rihanna, and it was a real pleasure. I'm really glad to have been able to do this. So thanks, everyone.